Hey everyone, I'm here with David Antonioli, and he's been a friend and colleague for a while, and was the CEO at Verra for almost 15 years, I think, and previously, has been an advocate for conservation and climate action for a long time before that. So really, thank you for being on today, and looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on the show. It's great to be here and lovely to talk to you about the work that's happening out there and see what's going on.
Yeah. So there's a few topics. So I posted on LinkedIn a few weeks ago, like, hey, I'm going to talk to David. What are people interested in knowing? And by far the largest thing that people were interested in talking about was Vera. Like, what happened? There's been so much criticism of Vera, but also just carbon markets in general. And maybe you just want to start there. If you want to tell just a little bit of the story of the past few years, and then maybe we can, go back into your earlier history. But
Yeah.
the past few years have been a bit rough, at least in voluntary carbon markets. And so I don't know if you want to just provide a little context for folks that you got to.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what your readers want to know, let me try to take a whack at it. I mean, a lot of people reached out to me. It's like, when are you gonna like post a thing that talks about all the stuff you heard, from the Guardian and kind of your perspective. And it's funny because we did publish that. I mean, we did push back pretty strongly, certainly on the Guardian. But kind of the history of that is really interesting. I mean, basically, we heard from the Guardian back in 2020, when they said, hey. They basically came to Vera and said, "Hey, we think your stuff is junk, and we have the data to prove it." And we said, "Okay, go ahead, let us know what you have." And they showed us a methodology which we proved to be completely useless. And we told them, actually, go talk to the guys at Global Forest Watch. You'll see that they'll tell you the same thing. And sure enough, that happened. And they kind of went back and forth and back and forth. And they did publish something early on, but it was clear to us that they actually had, you know, a very specific viewpoint that they wanted to put out. And at that point, it became clear to us that we weren't going to move them with data. And sure enough, at some point they came out with the other report, which got more traction and really did a lot of damage to the market. And ultimately, what I think is a failure of all of us, quite frankly, was that we weren't able to make the case that, look, these systems are evolving. They are never perfect, especially when you're creating a baseline for a kind of a parallel world. But we base our rules based on the latest scientific evidence, and that's what we did back when we started this journey. Back when we first started the journey, more than a decade ago. And I think there's a lack of patience and understanding about how hard it is to do this. Now, if I could go back and do it, would I have kind of accelerated the process for kind of the revision of the methodology? Absolutely. But at the time, what people don't appreciate is that when all this was starting to kind of bubble up, Vera didn't have that many resources. We were working on very thin budgets for a long time. 2014, 15, 16, even 17 were pretty dry years in the carbon market. That was one of the doldrums. And so it wasn't like we were sitting on tons of money that we had, could basically commission all this other work that probably needed to happen, but we didn't have the resources to do it. And so at some point we came around to doing it. And when we got the first call from the Guardian, actually, guess what? We had started that process, but that never really came out, unfortunately. And so, it's kind of like that old adage, like, hey, are you still beating your wife? And it's like when you get accused of something like that, it's very hard to make a kind of a defensible claim to say, well, no, I actually don't beat my wife. But the accusation is out there and it's already putting you on the defensive. And that's kind of like what happened, unfortunately. And for whatever reason, we weren't able to pull together sufficiently, whether it's resources or the narrative or whatever about what carbon markets are all about and how we're actually driving finance to these really important activities. But what we're seeing now is that actually, all this churn and this attacks on the carbon markets have really resulted in very detrimental impacts with people on the ground who are benefiting from projects. So what is it that we're trying to achieve? Ultimately, we're trying to achieve climate action by driving finance to places where we can actually make an impact. And I still fundamentally believe that carbon markets can do that. And we need to iterate and come up with better mousetraps, all for sure. And I think some of the work that I'm doing now is about that. But we need to be conscious that that what we're trying to do here is really trying to drive that finance and create a framework that actually works for the work on the ground. And I think that was missing. I think the attacks didn't really appreciate much of that.
Yeah. I think maybe one element of this failure is the failure of government or the failure of regulations. I'd be curious to hear, maybe from the early days of Verra, like, why did you actually start this organization? Like, what was the hole that was missing? Because I think some of that original intention, um, like some of the criticisms perhaps missed the point. So I'd just love to hear maybe a couple stories from the early days. Like what made you start this? What was the gap that it was trying to fill?
That's a great question. It actually relates a little bit to the work that I'm doing now. And that has to do with the fact that when I started, when I took the helm at Verra in 2008, it was a very different world. The EU ETS was in place. Obama had just been elected, right? We were all under the assumption that there was going to be cap and trade regulation in the US, like within a couple of years. China would follow suit, and pretty much the whole world was going to be regulated. And so what that meant, and this is I'm glad you asked this question. What did that mean for all the projects that were being developed through these offset programs, right? The debate we were having back then was, when regulations come on top of these projects, will they still be able to generate carbon credits, right? That was the discussion we were having. And yet that regulation, which was going to eventually require all landfill gas to be captured and destroyed or generate electricity, all forests to be protected, all industrial gases to be captured and destroyed. All those regulations never happened. So all of a sudden we created this model, this very cool, finance model, but we never really considered what happened at what I call at the end of the party, when the carbon crediting is done. So we really haven't designed the system to ensure that the interventions deliver long-term sustainable growth. And I think that, to me, is one of the things that we need to think about. How do we ensure that the carbon finance we're providing today delivers either scale, so that you reduce the cost of these interventions and you address the risk and you make it, common enough that people understand it, people accept it, and people therefore kind of move over to a new paradigm for doing business. So how to build the new businesses of the future, or in the case of projects that don't have, that kind of the underlying economic value, how do you ensure that governments or someone can take the helm of that project and make sure that it continues on when the carbon crediting is done? So that's a great example of where you could see a RED project, for example, being developed, being operated for 40 years, and then say, hey, government, whoever that government is, or maybe it's an indigenous community or whatever, you guys need to take over the responsibility for managing the forest when the carbon is over. And actually, if you create some trust funds or set aside some funds that provide for that, well, now it's not so daunting, right? But we've designed the system in a way that delivers that long-term trajectory. The folks at the American Family Forest Foundation are doing some interesting work on that. But really, ultimately, what we need to do is beyond the permanence debate, we need to design these project interventions so that they're durable. And when the carbon finance is over, then we have some confidence that they will continue operating, and that maybe they don't rely on carbon finance. But those were some of the early discussions we had with carbon. But the interesting thing is, back to your question, is that we never really had to contend when we first created this whole mechanism with what happens when the carbon crediting is over. We thought that there would be overarching regulations that would come into force and that would kind of resolve this issue. So now that we're not in that world, we need to figure that out. But I started this, I took the helm at Verra because I thought that the job was about a 5 or 6 year job. I thought that we would, demonstrate some new models, say, for example, in particular with AFLOAD, figure out how you can credit and support nature-based solutions. And that, within 5 years or 6 years, we would, close the door, turn the lights out, close the door, declare victory, and move on. But of course, that didn't happen, and so we kind of got into this model or this market that has sustained itself and ultimately has been able to be quite robust in light of economic downturns, attacks, etc. And ultimately, I think it is slowly but surely demonstrating that there's some real value to carbon finance and that it can really drive some important changes in the world. And if we can use those to create kind of the future of economic transitions, well, then we're achieving a bigger objective than just offsetting a ton of carbon. I think that to me is the real special sauce of where we could go with all this work.
Yeah. I'm curious, there's a lot of different directions we can take this, but you mentioned essentially, you thought you were going to be doing this for 5, 6 years, and then all these regulatory systems would come in and provide a much larger structured framework for you to sort of hand off into. You're getting it kickstarted, building a pilot and a methodology that the government could basically be like, oh yeah, here's the Verra methodologies, here's the registry system. Now we'll take it from here. Is that going to happen? And if so, where is it happening? Are there any bright spots? Or sort of like, what do we do now as a whole industry of sort of voluntary carbon market players, from corporations to finance groups to intermediaries to developers? What do we have to look forward to? Or is there a way that we can establish more power within the system to actually go influence regulation?
Wow. Great question. That's a tea leaves or like look at the crystal ball question. And I don't know. I mean, I think if I had my brothers, yes, absolutely, we'd have regulation and climate change would be addressed at some macro level. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So I think what we need to do in the carbon markets is be very thoughtful about how we design the system with the end in mind, right? Because I do think that we face somewhat of a systemic risk in that we may be developing projects left and right, but if we haven't figured out what happens when the last carbon credit is sold, I worry that those projects are at risk. Again, if it's a project that has an underlying economic value to it, maybe we don't reach the kind of scale or the market penetration that we could reach to kind of deliver that tipping point, and then the entire sector comes aboard, right? That would be great. But if we don't design it from the beginning, we're kind of shooting in the dark. And then with projects that don't have an economic value, we need to figure out what the mechanisms are. But this speaks to another thing that I think we haven't fully appreciated, and maybe relate to the regulation piece, but it has to do with additionality, right? Right now, again, human beings are generally really good about getting into things. We're very bad about getting out. And we're good about getting into carbon markets. But look at the debate that's happened with respect to renewable energy projects. It's still going on. I just got a call the other day from a reporter saying, hey, I'm doing some research. Are these projects really additional or not? What I think the failure of the market was to set some objectively verifiable piece of information, data point, that we could all agree, maybe we wouldn't all agree, but at least it's a data point that we say, look, at this point, these projects are no longer additional. As it was, kind of me and my time at Verra, we decided that they weren't not additional except for in least developed countries. And that's gotten a lot of pushback from different quarters. But I think what I think we need is to look at these interventions and look at additionality kind of more upfront, if you will, and not prosecute it, not litigate it, if you will, on a project by project basis, because that gets you into dynamic of at some point, somewhere, someone's going to say, these aren't additional. And then if you don't have something that you can objectively verify it against, then you get into these massive debates. And then you have these separations, right? Where you have one side of the aisle, like in this case, the developers with renewable energy saying, no, these are totally additional. You shouldn't stop this finance. And you have the NGO folks saying, no, these are totally not additional. These should never be approved, right? So you have this impasse. But you need to figure out a way that can thread the needle and that you can identify the point at which these projects are not additional, which would also do another thing, actually. It would give investors a lot more confidence. Right now, if you're an investor, right, you have to go into this process that's incredibly lengthy, very cumbersome, costly, takes forever, et cetera. And you really don't know until you finally get approved whether that project is going to be viable from a carbon credit generation perspective. And it's like you're sitting with this sort of Damocles, perpetually hanging over your head until you get the final approval. Um, and that's not a very good place for investors to be, right? And it should be no surprise that investors aren't rushing into the carbon markets because they look at this and say, oh my God, how complicated is this, right? When will I know that this project can even generate the credits? If we take that up front and we define like a set of activities that we know are additional, like let's restoring degraded pasture lands, like that should be on a what I would call a positive list assessment. Say like anybody restoring degraded pasture lands, you're in automatically. Now you'd have to set some eligibility criteria and some safeguards, but there are some project types where you could actually do that up front and be more confident and say, look, at this point, up until this point, we will accept these projects. So that would then allow investment to flow into this market and be able to kind of catalyze the kind of systemic change that we really need. And that way you can drive the new businesses of the future. So I think that there's quite a bit of opportunity in respect of how you design the system. But well, again, if we don't start with the end in mind, I think we're going to be perpetually kind of debating, is this additional or not? And if you're litigating it on an individual project basis, it just lends itself to this very, toxic debate between parties. Whereas we should do that up front, agree on, I mean, again, we're never going to agree, everybody's going to agree on everything, but we could have some sort of trajectory and say, look, at this point, when you've reached a certain level of market penetration, for example, no more crediting. That would at least give the investors an idea, confidence to invest, and the market an idea of what this looks like. And we could start to think about what we're trying to achieve, which ultimately is about systemic change. It isn't necessarily just about achieving a ton of carbon.
One of the points on additionality is I've been thinking a lot about conservation the past couple of years, and red in particular. Like, why is avoided deforestation the metric for valuing forests rather than simply paying people for standing forests because of the intrinsic value of that forest? Like, if there was example a system where, hey, if you have a standing primary rainforest or mature forest, you just get paid $50 or $100 per hectare per year, and that's it. Like just a flat or semi-flat just reward for biodiversity or conservation. Additionality seems like it comes in when you're trying to prioritize which areas should I do first, right? So like, hey, these areas are under threat, these other areas are not under threat, so we should, with a limited amount of money, focus on the areas that are threatened. But if you had an unlimited amount of money or enough money to cover the entire planet for conservation or the entire country, you wouldn't necessarily need additionality if you just assigned a value. And then there would be sort of a very, very simple balancing mechanism to be like, hey, do I mine for gold or do I protect the forest? And there would be sort of like there would just be a price on nature. And then the difference also between reforestation and conservation would also sort of be eliminated in some way where, hey, if you want to go plant a forest, rather than sort of getting the difference between a pasture land and a mature forest, you're essentially just creating an asset. You're creating this asset that you can go get money for every year. And it seems like a lot of the complexity of carbon markets was developed because there's not enough money to do the whole thing at once. I'm just curious, if you were to think about how to go do conservation and finance conservation at scale, um, what are the things we can do today with RED or our trees or these other sort of conservation mechanisms we have? What are ways in which they need to change in order to get adoption again? Or is there like a wholesale, bigger change that needs to happen over the next decade in terms of how we go and finance this? Because what I see in reforestation is that it's like 100 times more expensive to get a project started. And you can go spend $20 million, 10,000 hectares of reforestation, or $2 million on a couple 100,000 hectares of conservation. And so, but somehow that fell out of popularity. So I wonder if you just want to share, like, how do we go finance conservation now? Because this is seems
Yeah.
obvious, but we're not getting it done.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's a really big question. We could spend lots of time thinking about it. But I think that one of the things that we have done, which has been problematic, is we've created these silos, right? So just the way you described it, it's like you can do conservation over here, you can do restoration over here. Actually, those should work together, right? What's driving deforestation is a lack of economic opportunity to a large extent. I mean, there's some illegal activities, but that's also being driven by lack of economic opportunity, which is why you have legal mining, for example. But you've got a lot of, the deforestation taking place by people, chopping down the forest to be able to create a livelihood for themselves. That's lack of economic opportunity. And the only way you're going to do that, to address that, is you have to address the underlying driver of deforestation. And you can do all you can and all you want to stop that, to protect that forest, right? To do patrols, to do everything you can. But unless you address the economic opportunity, you're not going to solve the underlying problem. And so I think that where the opportunity is, that the economic opportunity comes in the restoration stuff, right? So restore those degraded lands. Maybe you start to create some sort of agroforestry or, timber or some sort of economic value that helps to restore that forest. Maybe not to its pristine state, because that's kind of an ideal world and we don't live in a perfect world. But if you can actually help restore that area so that it restores some of its biodiversity, some of its, its ecosystem, its ecosystem, but you provide some sort of economic opportunity, that starts to address the issue. But then that means you need to integrate RED and restoration. Right now, we've got those two as two totally separate things. So you've got to do one certification for RED and one for restoration. And in fact, the restoration rules kind of hinder you that, because the restoration rules are like, oh, this area has to have been deforested for 10 years before you can actually restore it, because we don't want to incentivize people to chop it down so they can grow it back. Well, guess what? That does. If you're looking at the edges of deforestation, that prevents you from working at the areas right where you should be investing. That's the area where there's a real opportunity to actually drive economic change. So I think that there's some rethink that we need to do just in terms of, again, what are we trying to achieve? And I don't think I think we've gotten a little stuck in the rabbit hole of the certification, trying to figure out how many, angels dance on the head of a pin, instead of figuring out what's the underlying or the overarching objective, which in this case is to provide economic opportunity. There's a great project in Peru called the Tambopata project. I love to talk about this because it's a great example, right?
We did a retreat with Earthshot in the Tambopata River
Okay.
last
Well,
year.
yeah. So were you at the lodge and where they, yeah. So I love that project because it highlights what's possible, but also identifies what's problematic, right? And it highlights what's possible because they took a red project that was being red area, natural protected area that the government couldn't protect. And they protected it by telling all the farmers around them, saying, hey, by the way, we're now building a processing facility for locally grown cacao. And if you want to process your cacao with us, you have to join the cooperative and you have to have a certain amount of tree cover. If you have it, you have to keep it. If you don't have, you have to plant. Very simple rules, right? So now guess what happened? All the farmers whose basic, economic viability depends on producing stuff. And normally what happens, they produce whatever, put it on the side of the road. Someone comes along, has massive asymmetry of information, has complete negotiating power over them, pays them a pittance for that product. But that's their reality. So what you do is you actually create economic opportunity so they can actually process their locally grown cacao in that local processing facility and derive value from that extra step in the process, right? So now that's exactly what happened. So pretty soon, farmers around the region started to reforest their lands, or they kept their forest cover. And so it worked to create economic opportunity. The real problem with that is because they didn't design it properly, they have a ton of removals that they can't capture because they didn't really consider that in the early phases. Now, and now people will argue, well, they're not additional, they would have happened anyway. Well, guess what? If we actually allowed them to capture the value of those removals, you could get more money to build further solutions or further processing centers and expand the scope of that. to create that model and expand it across the region. But we've created these silos that inhibit our ability to drive finance at scale. And ultimately, I mean, if you think about how carbon works, right, red is great because you can get the revenues pretty quickly because it's basically protecting a forest, you get the revenues pretty quickly. If you can use those to invest in processing facilities and restoration activities, those take a long time, but it actually helps you to bring in kind of a more diversified set of financial systems as financial returns that could allow you to kind of build a business across both project types. But it's really difficult because of the silos that we've created.
Yeah. So one of the takeaways that you learned was essentially that these sort of like landscape level projects where there's an element of agroforestry, of native reforestation, of conservation, maybe of sustainable logging in some cases, that combining those different kinds of activities into a holistic project design is really important, even though right now regulations or sort of the certification process through most registries separate those activities pretty strongly. Uh,
Exactly.
that's one thing that I think we're focusing a lot more on. Like, hey, in the same region, can you go do all these activities and then you have durability even beyond the lifetime of what a carbon
Exactly.
is?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's ultimately true. Imagine if you, I mean, this cacao example is great, right? So now you've got a sustainable cacao supply chain, right? That Nestle probably would like to have because now they've got sustainable cacao and it's next to a beautiful rainforest that's being protected and it's actually in an area that's actually been sustained, it's been restored. So it's a great story. So it kind of fits into the supply chain. So I mean, to me, that's a great argument for the food and agro companies to invest in these kinds of projects because it can deliver those products that become part of the supply chain, which a lot of consumers want.
Yeah. So a couple more questions. One is kind of like, what do we do now? What is the most important leverage point that, myself or someone at Earthshot or yourself or someone, chief sustainability officer at a company, like what's the important step for us to take now? And it's sort of like what is the frontier of the carbon market? Or I don't know, maybe it's like, hey, we're putting together a catalytic finance facility to help accelerate project development. Like that's where I see a leverage point. I'm just curious where you see the highest leverage points for people to have impact, or maybe it's a lobbying government. I don't know.
Um, I actually think that the highest leverage point is figuring out how we can use carbon to deliver other benefits that more readily have value in our economy. Like carbon, you and I might value it and might be willing to pay something for it, but the general economy doesn't value it. But to the extent that we can link carbon to some sort of sustainable outcome that has an economic value to it, I think that to me is the key. Now that, of course, raises questions about additionality, right? And everybody will say, well, no. It's kind of the purest kind of credit. And I'll tell the story from my life, even before Verra. I developed landfill gas projects under the CDM. And we developed projects that generated electricity and ones that just captured the gas and destroyed it and flared it. Today, the projects that were generating electricity are fine. Like the crediting period ended and those projects are still cranking away, they're generating electricity, right? And at the time, they were very questioned, like, maybe I have to be additional because you have some revenues, et cetera. Same argument with renewables. And yet our argument was like, well, this doesn't even exist in this country. So so we were able to get through that. The projects that just captured landfill gas and destroyed it, many of them are dead. The equipment's been vandalized. The pipes in the ground are rotting. The staff we trained are working elsewhere. So what did we achieve, right? So what I find that the carbon market has been doing, and I think it's unfortunate, is it penalizes or it treats with utter suspicion anything that has an economic value to it. So what I think we need to do again, rather than litigating that on each individual basis. Let's take a sector-wide approach and identify those activities that we know are additional, because even though they may have some sort of economic value, today they are not happening for a number of reasons. This is the way the Climate Action Reserve works, right? That's how their model works, create a standardized approach that creates that benchmark. Verra has some rules, ACR has some rules as well, some methodologies that do that. I think we need to do that a lot more to give the market more confidence, and then be able to identify, create that scale that we need. And ultimately, what you need is something that addresses, that enables those economic drivers to catalyze them, so we can actually get enough. And so this is actually kind of Econ 101, right? What prevents new businesses from getting traction? Well, costs are high in the very beginning, right? People perceive huge risk, and whether it's real risk or perceived risk doesn't really matter. People don't like them, right? So give the example of regenerative ag, right? If you have 100 farmers, and the first one goes to the local bank officer and says, "Hey, can I get a loan? I want to do some regenerative ag." Bank officer's like, "Are you crazy? Like, nobody else has done this. This is very risky. There's no evidence that this is going to work. No, I will not give you a loan." Now, if you play that forward and you use carbon finance to get a whole bunch of farmers to do this, and the numbers suggest that the right penetration rate is somewhere around 16%, and that varies by sector, et cetera. But let's just assume it's 16% when you hit the tipping point, right? So you get 16 farmers to do regenerative ag. And actually, guess what? They find that it's a better solution. Their revenues come back despite some dips, because you've got to change crops, you got to change practices. Maybe you had a fungus or some sort of plague they had to deal with, but by then you've got companies that help you figure that out. The risks are perceived, and so the risks are lowered. And so now there's a whole bunch of farmers that do this. Now take that 17th farmer. 17th farmer goes to the same bank officer. "Can I get a loan to do regenerative ag?" That officer is going to say, "You know what? Actually, I've seen Troy and David and John and Mary and whoever. I've seen 16 farmers do this, and they're doing really well. And guess what? The farmers are better protected against the floods and drought. That flood that came back through last year, those farms did better than the other guys. So yes, I will give you a loan." So now what you've done is you've catalyzed a whole new sector of the economy. You use carbon to deliver 16 farmers, right? And they've achieved some carbon. But guess what? Now you get 17 and 20 and 30 and 50 and ideally 60 or 70%. There will be some laggards for sure. But now you've transformed the entire sector, because you've been able to reduce the cost, address the risks, and create capacity. And that's what we're missing. That's the model we should be using. And so when you ask, what should we be thinking about? We should be using carbon finance to drive the businesses of the future. And I think that, to me, is one place where I think it's pretty exciting. And, quite frankly, if you think about, the cuts that are happening, here in Washington, all the USAID cuts, they're really, really painful. But one thing that it has forced some folks to do is say, okay, well then, how are we going to make this happen? Right? And if we can leverage and rely on kind of the market mechanisms, but be smart about it, so that we use carbon in a thoughtful way to achieve a bigger objective, I think we will have achieved something.
Cool. I really like the perspective of like, what is the what is the use of the carbon market today, and having a basically an off ramp, sort of like the same off ramp from philanthropy. How hey, you have maybe $500,000, and you could go buy a few hectares of land. Maybe with carbon finance, you can protect tens or hundreds of thousands of hectares, and sort of lever up that initial philanthropy with private investment capital and sale of carbon credits. And then the next stage is, okay, what is the even larger business model for this region? That's a combination of agroforestry and forestry and value add agricultural products, or whatever it is, in combination. Or ecotourism. The Tamapato Lodge is a great example where that's suddenly a huge economic driver. So I like that sort of approach of, hey, you have a little bit of philanthropy, you have a pretty significant amount of carbon finance, and then you have sort of this steady state economy. Um, that's
Yeah, I think the off-ramp concept is really useful, right? And we haven't been forced to think about it. And I think is the next, I mean, I would argue is the next phase. And quite frankly, I had this realization just a few weeks ago when I was at a conference, and I realized like, oh yeah, the reason we never thought about this is because we thought that all these other regulations were going to come on top, but they never did. So now we're left with this pretty cool financing mechanism, but we have to perfect it a bit more. And I think we just need to figure out, starting with the end in mind, figuring out what that end game, that off ramp looks like. And if we can create that, well then. And I talk to people about this, and people say, "Well, David, that's the criticism of the market, right? We don't want you criticizing the market. What we really need to do is focus on demand." And my response to that is like, actually, this is focusing on demand. I bet you, soup to nuts, that the big buyers are going to be much more comfortable investing in something that they believe has a design or is designed in a way to transition to a more sustainable future, let alone the fact that this addresses permanence in a huge way, right?
Yeah.
If you figured out this durability issue through an economic system, we spend a whole lot of time debating how long should projects last? Should it be 20 years, 30 years, 40, 50, 100? We spend loads of time discussing how big the buffer should be, right? Should the minimum requirement 20%? Well, you know what? Those are all fine discussions. But if we can design a systemic solution to the permanence issue by creating new businesses that address, in the case of deforestation, the underlying drivers of deforestation, well, there's your solution right there. What that does, I mean, going back to even the trust fund example, if you start to create a trust fund that you're going to park and build up over 40 years, right, that then the government or a community group can use to continue those forest conservation measures, guess what? Guess what happens to your buffer? It goes way down. There's extra money, right? So, and that's, I mean, for a buyer, that's great. So we need to think about what the end game is for a number of reasons so that we have longevity, but also because it addresses some of the systemic challenges that the market faces.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. There's also a bit of it's sort of like this design for economic sustainability is also reducing dependence on government to implement regulations. Like sort of like we started out in our ideal world, maybe there's a emissions tax where, producers of fossil fuels are taxed to the point of production and that sort of disperses through the whole economy. And then there's, a reward for conservation and reforestation where some of those revenues go into nature. Like that's kind of like the picture that we've been holding for the past decade or two. And it hasn't happened yet. And so, at least my understanding of what you're saying is that, okay, what if it never happens that way? Can we still go address the climate and ecological crisis? If so, then we need to incorporate all these other potential businesses in sort of this landscape design, agroforestry, et cetera. But if those regulations do happen, maybe we're all good, like like the sustainability can be built into the economic system where actually it is enough just to be a forest ranger and be essentially in a park area where there's bands of agroforestry around the outside, but you're not
Mhm.
dependent solely on that financial reality.
Yeah.
I'm still
I mean,
holding out for this regulatory shift because I think that just the economic incentives alone aren't without any regulatory change, like won't be enough to actually address the scale of this crisis. That's my personal opinion
mhm.
right now, where the incentives for emissions, you know, won't go down. Like, hey, if we're not, penalizing emissions, then that won't really change. But then if we're not rewarding conservation, then alternative uses of that land, like gold mining in the Amazon, are always going to be more value. And so then the default, economic scenario is that extractive economic scenarios in the Amazon in particular, like are probably going to be more valuable than anything regenerative we can do. You chop down the forest and you do gold mining, and in the short term, that makes more money than doing something where you're building these long agricultural or agroforestry supply chains. Um,
Mhm.
that's my thought. So I hope
Yeah.
both happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of an eternal optimist. I'm a policy wonk. I was trained as in policy. So I would love there to be a good government framework that, regulates greenhouse gas emissions.
Maybe
And
to
I
that
think,
point. is there something we can do to influence policy? Obviously, like having this conversation, maybe there's a lawmaker that listens to it, but it's kind of on the margin. Like, is there a more powerful way for us to interact with government? I don't know, come together as an industry. Like, what? It just hasn't happened yet. And so I'm like, who's at the top that I can go call to go and make policy shift? I don't know if
Yeah.
you have the answer to that question, but like, what do we do?
Well, there is some interesting work on government, and AITA is involved. They lobby government. There's a new organization called the Business Alliance for Climate Action, I think is called BACA. Most of the time, what folks are doing on the policy front is playing defense because you've got these regulations that are being put forth in respect of, companies being held liable for any carbon credits they might buy, right? Which is like companies buying voluntary credits, they're not being held liable for that. It's just a huge disincentive to action. So it's oftentimes having to play defense. So there's some folks who are thinking about this, and they're much smarter and better able to kind of addressing that particular question. But I think coming back to your original point was that I do think that there's a come to Jesus moment where we need to recognize that we shouldn't rely on the government sorting this out for us. Where we can design the market and the project intervention so that they can stand on their own or be in a better position to stand on their own, we should by all means absolutely do that. But I mean, I think that there's a big hole, and we can have a debate about whether we can actually create enough economic activity to sustain them. And there'll be some cases where yes, some cases where no. I mean, there's some really interesting projects, both on the nature-based solutions, but also on the tech side, right? So I advise a company that does asphalt repaving, asphalt recycling, and this is kind of like very simple but very cool, right? What they do, the common practice in the market is you take asphalt when you repave a road like a highway, you go in and you rip it all up, you send it over to some depot, and you bring in fresh virgin material. You've mined it, you've taken it to the processing facility, you've heated it up, you've added stuff to it, you've taken it over to the site, and then you lay it down. It's called hot mix asphalt, right? Hugely, hugely greenhouse gas intensive. And what this company does is called Global Missionary. They actually are promoting this technology where you actually do what's called cold in place recycling. So you take that same road, you dig it up, you throw it in the back of the truck, you process it right there, and you lay it right back down. So you take your recycling rates from 20 to 30% up to above 90%. You do not have to mine virgin material. You do not have to process it. You do not lay it down hot. It's a very, very efficient process. And yet it's a tiny fraction. There's, I think, 17 contractors that do this and 4,000 hot mix asphalt contractors. A lot of the hot mix asphalt contractors are vertically integrated, so they own the mine, they own the processing facility, and guess what? They look at this cold recycling stuff and they see a threat to their business. So they lobby and they push hard to avoid cold recycling to be in place. So over time, and in order to do cold recycling, you need the equipment, you need the training, etc. But over time, this would be a better solution that could stand on its own if we're able to get it to the tipping point. But we've got challenges. So the idea that what we're working on is try to use carbon finance to get enough traction so we can start to displace the perception that this is bad technology, but sorry, my dog's sneezing. That this perception that has been foisted upon the industry by the hot mix asphalt folks that actually this stuff is bad, it gives you bad roads, etc. So there are some technologies, some approaches that I think could be able to stand the test of time if we reach that market penetration or that level of activity. My dog's now shaking. I don't know if you heard that. But the point is that there's some models for how we can drive new technologies and new approaches that reduce costs, address risks, or address perception issues that gets you to a point where you now have a more sustainable outcome.
Maybe as we wrap up, I mean, you've shown amazing sort of perseverance, I would say, in this field over the past, years and decade. I'm wondering if you have a lesson that you've learned or something that you want to share with the folks listening, because what I'm going to guess is that we will not address the scale of the ecological and climate crisis in the next 2 years, the next 5 years, in the next decade, maybe in our lifetimes. And so it's going to require like continual like coming back to the source of motivation. So I'm just curious, like, where do you source your motivation, or do you have anything that you want to leave the folks listening to this with to like, sort of
Yeah.
like keep them inspired of like, hey, keep going on this.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. There's a number of things that I draw inspiration from. I mean, I took my family over spring break and we went, hiking, and it was just, in a beautiful gorge in the next to the Shenandoah Mountains in the Monongahela National Forest. And the ability to kind of walk up the trail, and we actually went swimming. My wife didn't, she was too cold, but my son and daughter and I, we jumped in the water, and it was just this glorious moment where, here we are out in nature in this beautiful place. And to think that, those places are threatened, and that our, myself and my kids and other generations and other people won't be able to enjoy those, is just really heart-wrenching. I find that, from a purely economic perspective, so much of our economy depends on nature, whether it's water, whether it's food, whether it's air, and we just don't value it. So I just feel like sometimes I feel like it's kind of the only thing I know how to do. So I'm kind of, doing carbon because it's what I know how to do. But I do find that there's some element of a reward in knowing that we're pushing forward and coming up with new models and better solutions. And at least, some of them are going to stick. And I think, so far we've been able to demonstrate that the carbon markets are sticking around. They're not going away. And despite all we hear everywhere, especially here in Washington, carbon markets are still there, and they may not have the pole position that we might have hoped for, a couple of months ago, but they're still there, and there's still kind of activity happening. There's still investments happening. And I think that's really motivating to see the work of a lot of companies, a lot of, investors, and, people coming into this market thinking that there's something there. And so that sustains me as well. But, there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, but, I guess I'd start from the kind of my own direct experience in nature. I love it. I love to go on hikes. I go on a backpacking trip with old friends every year. And those are really just wonderful experiences to have, and to know that we can conserve those, but even restore them. And ultimately, again, if we can figure out how we create economic models, because that's what our economy relies on, right? If we can create those values, I think that can just be tremendously powerful. And I think there's plenty of room to be growing into that. So I think there's still quite a bit to go, and I'm hopeful that we'll get there.
Thank you for this time, David. I also really love basically the reality that the love of nature and the joy of having experiences with your family in nature is this sort of like shared tent pole that we can all join around. Like, who hasn't had that sort of experience? Like, that is something that for me is that's also why I do this. It is sort of a love of nature and love of our experiences together with other species and beautiful places. And just really appreciate you bringing it in of like, can we all be on the same team? Can the folks criticizing carbon markets, can the folks working on new financial instruments, people and corporations, if we can come together around that shared tent pole and sort of like realize, hey, we are on the same team and we're trying different methods to achieve the same goals, maybe through that sort of more active creative collaboration, this will go a lot faster.
Mm,
At least that's
yeah,
hope that I have for us. But thank you for this time, and yeah, and the work
yeah.
you've done over the past decades.
Oh, well, no, thank you for having me on the show. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for those really good questions. I found those to be very thought-provoking, and hopefully was insightful and helpful to your audience. Thank you. Thank you, Troy.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Cheers, man. Bye-bye. Ciao.